It's Masters Lock. We got to talk about this Game 7 with Mark Masters and special guest star, Pierre LeBrun. But another lopsided loss for the Toronto Maple Leafs, another devastating loss for this fan base. How did Game 7 get away from the Toronto Maple Leafs, guys?
Oh, Jay. You know what the biggest Masters lock was, in retrospect, was that the Leafs were going to lose Game 5, win Game 6, bring back the hope, and then lose Game 7. Okay. Let's not lose sight of the fact that this was the longest run of this era. You know, they were a game away from the Eastern Conference Final. This was the biggest game in 23 years. And yet somehow it feels like the worst loss. Just lopsided at home on the heels of that Game 5 lopsided at home. What went wrong? Like, you're not going to get the answers, I don't think, post-game. Austin Matthews, interestingly, said there was too many passengers. Haven't heard that kind of comment from Austin Matthews in these previous elimination games. Mitch Marner agreed with that assessment. Craig Berube talked about it being something between the ears. And he's so many times when he's talked about this group, he's downplayed the past. But Pierre, I don't know how you can't make the connection to the past when you see a performance like this.
I think you have to, Mark. And that's what I asked Craig Berube. You were there, Mark, is that how much of the past playoff baggage, which Craig Berube himself was not part of, but I said to him, how much of that ends up feeding into a night like tonight where, again, the moment seems too big for them. And I thought Craig Berube gave a pretty thoughtful answer because in some ways he felt that the Leafs showed in Game 6 in Ottawa and Game 6 in Florida that the moment isn't too big for them. But to your point, then he said in terms of Game 5 and Game 7 where they outscored 12-2 total between Game 5 and Game 7 here in this series, that there's something between the ears. That, to me, is about the playoff baggage. And it is. I honestly think that there are guys that have been here in the Matthews era, including him, that have lived this movie too much where it has to be the type of mental scarring that affects you. Like a putter who loses, a golfer loses his putting skills for a while, right? I mean, there's just something that weighs on you as a player where you start Game 7 and the shot attempts are 21-0 for Florida through 7 minutes. You're not ready to play the biggest game of the year. I'm sorry. And it's not because the coaching staff didn't get you ready. It's something that just overwhelms this core.
And speaking of this core, 2 of the 4 members of the core are unrestricted free agents this offseason, as you gentlemen both know. I want to focus on Mitchell Marner. Do you think this is the end of Mitch Marner's time in Toronto?
Sure feels like it. You know, it's sad, to be honest with you, for a guy who's from here. You know, he was hearing boos when he touched the puck late in this game. And he was a little reflective after the game, talking about how, Toronto took him. It was maybe a risky pick on a smaller guy, and he's not taking it for granted. And then you see a game like tonight where, again, it doesn't go his way. He's part of this. There's frustration that he's showing at the bench there. He talked about being devastated after this game, sad, depressed even. And it does feel like he didn't want to talk about his future, but it did feel like this is the end.
Feels like a guy that just needs a change of scenery, honestly. And let's remember how this year has played out. I mean, entering the last year of his contract, his camp, led by agent Darren Ferris, they were pretty consistent in their approach, was that they did not want to really negotiate with the Maple Leafs during this year. They wanted to play out the season and see how things went. And let's not forget that the Leafs also went to them at the trade deadline and asked them if they'd be willing to waive in a potential trade with the Carolina Hurricanes. And, Mikko Rantanen as a Leaf, that's a whole other conversation, given how these playoffs have played out again for the Leafs and how Rantanen's playing in Dallas. But so all this leading up to this moment where it's not just Mitch Marner having to decide whether or not he wants to stay or leave, but it's also the Toronto Maple Leafs as a management group that have to decide, does it make sense even to sign him? Sounds crazy to point out, but I think the time has come to shake up the core here in a meaningful way.
I don't think that's a crazy thing to say at all, Pierre. Brad Marchand, 5-0 in Game 7s against the Toronto Maple Leafs. It's almost unbelievable when you think about it. What makes this guy such a Leaf killer?
Well, he actually, Jay, minimized his performance in some of those Boston Game 7s against Toronto. He said he was just lucky to be part of those teams that beat the Leafs. Listen, he knows how to read a room, and he knows that Leaf fans are gutted here again. And it was a very diplomatic Brad Marchand on this night, when asked about being a Leafs killer. And he said, listen, I grew up a Leafs fan, he pointed out, which he's not said in a long time. But it seems to ring a bell that he said that when he was younger. And he enjoys the stage. He understands the theatrics about being an NHL star and that Toronto's the biggest stage. That's what he got into. He loves playing here in Toronto. He loves being part of playoff series against the Maple Leafs. But at the end of the day, he also talked about how it's somewhat unfair for the Leafs players to get crucified in this market every time they lose in the playoffs. And it's so similar to comments that Matthew Tkachuk made to me 2 years ago after Florida beat Toronto in this building and eliminated them. The pressure that the Stars feel in this market, it's interesting to hear it from other star players on other teams.
Yeah, Brad Marchand spent a lot of his news conference after being part of this big win where he was amazing in the game, amazing in the series, defending the Leafs and talking about how he thinks they're treated unfairly here and how that pressure can't help but seep in with what, you know, he's talking about the fan reaction here. Quite something. But yeah, Marchand does it to him again. You know, he beats him on the ice and then he, you know, slaps around the Leafs fans in his media session, Jay. Just another tour de force for Brad Marchand.
Unbelievable. Now he's off to another Eastern Conference final while the Leafs 0-7 in winner-take-all games since 2018. But you guys were terrific. This has been another edition of Master's Lock.